The honey heist. Jack Grayson had always known that living under the iron fist of the Meadowview Homeowners Association would come with its share of frustrations. The rules were endless. Grass couldn't grow past 3 inches, fences had to be painted eggshell white, and heaven forbid anyone dared to park a pickup truck in their own driveway overnight. But Jack had carved out his own little slice of rebellion in the form of 3 thriving beehives tucked away in the corner of his backyard. They were his pride and joy, a buzzing testament to years of patience, research, and tender care. The honey they produced wasn't just sweet. It was a symbol of everything he'd built despite the HOA's constant meddling. He'd never imagined, though, that someone would have the gall to steal them. Not in broad daylight. Not right under his nose. It was a crisp Saturday morning in early March when Jack first noticed something was off. He'd been sipping his coffee on the back porch, watching the bees dance around the hives in their usual industrious rhythm, when he decided to head inside for a refill. By the time he returned, not 20 minutes later, the hives were gone. Vanished. The patch of earth where they'd stood was bare, save for a few stray bees buzzing in confusion. His stomach dropped. "What the hell?" he muttered, setting his mug down on the railing and stepping closer. The grass was trampled, and there were faint tire tracks leading toward the gate. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been subtle about it. Jack wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he had a sinking feeling he knew who was behind this. Vanessa Hargrove, the self-proclaimed queen of Meadowview, had been eyeing his hives for months. She'd sent him snippy letters about unapproved agricultural activity and cornered him at the last HOA meeting to lecture him about how bees were a liability to the neighborhood. Jack had brushed her off, citing state laws that protected backyard beekeeping, but Vanessa wasn't the type to let rules or common decency stand in her way. He stormed back into the house and pulled up the footage from his security cameras, a system he'd installed after Vanessa had once tried to fine him for leaving a wheelbarrow out overnight. The grainy video confirmed his suspicions. There she was, strutting onto his property like she owned it, her blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail and her lips pursed in that smug, entitled way she always had. She wasn't alone, either. 2 of her loyal minions, a wiry guy named Ted and a perpetually nervous woman named Cheryl, trailed behind her. They'd brought a pickup truck, and together, the trio loaded Jack's hives onto the bed like they were picking up furniture from a garage sale. Jack watched, jaw clenched, as Vanessa directed the operation with the confidence of a dictator. She didn't even glance around to see if anyone was watching. No mask, no hood, no attempt to hide what she was doing. It was HOA arrogance in its purest form, the kind that came from years of unchecked power. Ted struggled with the weight of the hives, nearly dropping one, while Cheryl kept glancing nervously toward Jack's house, clearly less convinced this was a good idea. But Vanessa? She marched on, unfazed, as if Jack's years of hard work were nothing more than a decorative trinket she'd decided to claim. He should have been furious. He should have jumped in his truck, driven straight to Vanessa's pristine McMansion, and demanded his bees back. Part of him wanted to. God, did he want to? But another part, the part that had dealt with Vanessa's nonsense for 3 years, was just curious. How exactly did she plan to handle an entire colony of bees? Did she think they'd just sit there, buzzing happily in her backyard, because she'd decided they belonged to her now? The thought almost made him laugh. Jack decided to bide his time. Vanessa's arrogance had a way of digging her own graves. He'd seen it before, like when she tried to ban holiday lights to preserve the neighborhood aesthetic and ended up with a revolt of angry residents stringing up the gaudiest decorations they could find. If she wanted to play beekeeper, let her try. He'd get his hives back one way or another. But first, he wanted to see her crash and burn. The next day, Jack took a leisurely stroll down Meadowview Lane toward Vanessa's house. He didn't need an excuse. He was just a neighbor out for a walk, but the anticipation of what he might find quickened his steps. Vanessa's place was impossible to miss. A 2-story colonial with a lawn so manicured it looked like it belonged in a magazine, not a real neighborhood. Her backyard, usually as sterile as a showroom floor, now held an unexpected sight. His beehives, plopped unceremoniously in the middle of her pristine grass. Vanessa stood nearby, dressed in what she must have thought was beekeeping gear. She wore thick gardening gloves, a wide-brimmed sun hat, and a mosquito net draped over her head like a cheap Halloween costume. Next to her was her husband, Martin, a balding man with the defeated air of someone who'd stopped arguing with his wife years ago. He held a can of bug spray, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot as Vanessa inspected the hives. Jack leaned against her white picket fence, crossing his arms and watching as she tried to pry open one of the hives with a metal spatula. The sight was so absurd, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Careful there, Vanessa," he called out, unable to resist. "That's not a jar of peanut butter you're opening." She whirled around, her eyes narrowing as a flush crept up her neck. She'd been caught, and she knew it, but Vanessa Hargrove wasn't the type to admit defeat. "This is HOA business," she snapped, jabbing the spatula in his direction. "You can't just keep dangerous insects on your property without board approval." "Dangerous insects?" Jack raised an eyebrow, fighting back a laugh. "They're bees, Vanessa. They make honey. You know, that stuff you put on your toast." Her lips tightened, but before she could fire back, she turned back to the hive and gave the spatula a hard yank. The wooden frame popped open with a creak, and for one glorious second, everything was still. Then came the buzz, a low, angry hum that grew louder by the heartbeat. A cloud of bees erupted from the hive, furious at the intrusion, and Vanessa froze, her brain clearly struggling to process the mistake she'd just made. Then chaos. She shrieked, dropping the spatula and flailing her arms like a cartoon character as the swarm descended. The bees, territorial and pissed off, zeroed in on her, darting under her makeshift mosquito net and into her hair. Martin, proving he was just as clueless, panicked and started spraying bug spray into the air, which only made the bees angrier. Jack ducked as Martin flung the can in a blind frenzy, sending it sailing into Vanessa's perfectly trimmed rose bushes. Vanessa bolted, mid-sprint across her backyard, and ran smack into her patio furniture. Her shin caught the edge of a glass table, and she face-planted onto it with a thud. The table didn't break, but the way she scrambled back up, waving her arms and screaming, made it clear the bees had found their mark. Jack could see red welts blooming on her neck and arms as she darted toward the house, Martin stumbling behind her. Jack took his time strolling up to her front porch, still grinning as he knocked politely. From inside, Vanessa's muffled voice screamed, "This is a nightmare." The door was locked, but he could hear frantic swatting and Martin muttering something incoherent. "Maybe if you hadn't stolen my beehives, this wouldn't be happening, huh?" Jack called through the door, crossing his arms. There was a long silence, then more swatting. "You'll be hearing from the HOA about this," Vanessa shouted, her voice shrill with rage. Jack laughed. "Oh, I can't wait." He turned and headed home, the sound of Vanessa's muffled curses fading behind him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Vanessa might have thought she'd won by taking his bees, but Jack knew her well enough to know she'd overplay her hand. She always did. And when she did, he'd be ready. 2 days later, an official HOA notice arrived in Jack's mailbox. The letter, written in Vanessa's unmistakable self-righteous tone, declared that his bees had been deemed an unapproved agricultural nuisance and would now be managed by the HOA for the sake of neighborhood safety. It went on to say that, due to unprovoked bee aggression experienced by some residents, Jack could guess who. The HOA was taking charge of all beekeeping operations in Meadowview. In short, Vanessa had decided she could just keep his bees. Jack read the letter twice, shaking his head. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. He tossed it onto his kitchen counter and leaned back in his chair, thinking. Vanessa wasn't just stealing his property. She was turning this into some kind of twisted HOA power grab. He'd heard rumors she'd been scheming to fund a neighborhood beautification project, and now it clicked. She planned to sell the honey. Probably under some fake HOA-branded label, too, knowing her. He did some digging that afternoon, calling up a friend who worked at the local farmer's market. Sure enough, Vanessa had shown up that morning with a stack of handwritten jars labeled Vanessa's Pure Organic Honey, proudly telling vendors that the HOA was now providing locally sourced product. Jack couldn't help but smirk. She had no idea what she was in for. The problem was, Vanessa didn't know the first thing about bees. Jack's hives had thrived under specific conditions, carefully chosen flowers, no pesticides, and a quiet corner of his yard where they could work undisturbed. Shoved into Vanessa's sterile, chemical-laden backyard, the bees were suffering. The honey she'd managed to harvest was a disaster. Bitter and sour, a far cry from the golden sweetness Jack had perfected over years. By the end of the weekend, word got back to him that Vanessa was facing a full-blown farmers market revolt. Customers were returning jars, demanding refunds, while vendors laughed in her face as she tried to insist real honey just tastes different when it's organic. Jack could have let it end there. He could have sat back and watched her flounder, knowing she'd never pull off her little honey empire. But Vanessa wasn't giving up. She was doubling down, claiming she had full legal ownership of the hives under some obscure HOA rule she'd probably invented on the spot. That was the last straw. Jack wasn't about to let her get away with it. He spent the next hour researching, flipping through state laws and environmental regulations. Then he found it. Beekeeping without proper permits in a residential area was a violation, and mishandling hives could be reported to the Environmental Protection Agency. Jack grinned. This wasn't just Vanessa versus him anymore. It was about to be Vanessa versus the government. And he had a front row seat. He picked up his phone and dialed the EPA's regional office, filing a detailed complaint about the HOA's unauthorized beekeeping and environmental destruction. As he hung up, he leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Vanessa had no idea what was coming. Jack Grayson didn't have to wait long to see Vanessa Hargrove's grand beekeeping experiment implode. By Monday morning, whispers were already rippling through Meadowview about her weekend at the farmer's market. Jack's friend, Pete, who ran a stall selling homemade pickles, called him up with the details, barely able to keep the laughter out of his voice. She showed up with these jars, Jack, Pete said, snickering. Handwritten labels. Vanessa's pure organic honey, like she's some artisanal genius. Looked like a kid's craft project. And the honey? Man, it was awful. Bitter as hell. People were spitting it out right there in front of her. Jack leaned against his kitchen counter, grinning. Let me guess, she didn't take it well? Oh no. She doubled down. Started lecturing everyone about how real honey's supposed to taste like that, because it's organic. Vendors were dying laughing. One guy told her she should stick to her day job, whatever that is. Jack could picture it perfectly. Vanessa, in her pressed blouse and pearl earrings, standing there with her arms crossed, trying to convince a crowd of skeptical farmers market regulars that her sour sludge was a delicacy. It was almost too good. Almost. He hung up with Pete and decided to take another stroll past Vanessa's house. If she was still trying to play beekeeper, he wanted to see it for himself. Sure enough, when he reached her backyard fence, there she was, back at it. The hive sat in the same spot, looking worse for wear after her amateur meddling. Vanessa had swapped her gardening gloves for a pair of oven mitts, and was wielding a wooden spoon this time, poking at the frames like she was stirring a pot of soup. Martin hovered nearby, holding a garden hose with the nozzle aimed vaguely at the hives, as if he thought he could wash the bees away if they got out of hand again. Jack couldn't help himself. He leaned on the fence and called out, "You're going to need more than a spoon to get honey out of those, Vanessa." She spun around, her face already red from exertion or embarrassment, hard to tell. "This is none of your business, Jack Grayson," she snapped, jabbing the spoon at him. "These hives are under HOA control now. You lost your chance to play farmer." "Farmer?" Jack chuckled. "I'm not the one out here pretending I know what I'm doing. How's that pure organic honey working out for you?" Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the hive and gave the spoon a hard jab. The frame shifted, and that familiar angry buzz filled the air. Jack took a step back, knowing what was coming. Vanessa didn't. She yanked the frame free, and the bees erupted again, this time angrier, faster, a black and yellow storm cloud zeroing in on her. "Oh, not again," she shrieked, dropping the spoon and flailing her oven-mitt hands. The bees swarmed her, diving into the gaps between her mitts and sleeves, buzzing furiously around her head. Martin, ever the hero, turned on the hose and sprayed a wild arc of water, hitting Vanessa square in the back instead of the bees. She yelped, slipping on the wet grass and landing flat on her backside, the hose still drenching her as the bees continued their assault. Jack doubled over laughing, clutching the fence for support. Vanessa scrambled to her feet, soaked and swearing, and bolted for the house with Martin trailing behind, the hose still spraying uselessly. The back door slammed shut, and Jack could hear her muffled yells from inside. Something about those damn bees, and this isn't over. He wiped a tear from his eye and headed home, still chuckling. Vanessa's backyard fiasco was better than he'd hoped. But he knew her well enough to know she wouldn't let a little thing like a bee attack stop her. She was stubborn as a mule and twice as proud. Sure enough, by Wednesday, word spread that she'd gone back to the farmer's market with a fresh batch of jars, this time claiming she'd perfected the recipe. Pete filled him in again. She was out there with a new spiel, Meadowview's finest honey, she called it. Said the first batch was just a test run. But it was the same garbage, Jack. People were returning it faster than she could sell it. One lady threw a jar at her feet and told her to stop poisoning the neighborhood. Jack shook his head, amazed. She's got guts, I'll give her that. Guts or no brains, Pete said. The vendors are done with her. They're talking about banning her from the market if she shows up again. Jack wasn't surprised. Vanessa's honey was a disaster because she'd ruined the bees' environment. His hives had thrived on the wildflowers and clover he'd planted around his yard, free from pesticides and pollution. Vanessa's backyard, on the other hand, was a chemical wasteland. Her lawn was doused with weed killer, and her roses were sprayed with insecticides every other week. The bees didn't stand a chance. What little honey they produced under her care was tainted, a bitter reflection of her incompetence. Still, she refused to give up. By Friday, Jack got wind of her next move through a neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, who'd overheard Vanessa bragging at the grocery store. She's planning to sell the honey online now, Mrs. Delaney said, her eyes wide with disbelief. Says she's got a boutique brand in the works. Wants to use the profits for some HOA project, new street signs or something. Jack snorted. She's delusional. No one's buying that swill. She thinks they will, Mrs. Delaney said. She's convinced herself it's a gold mine. Jack went home and checked online, and sure enough, there it was, a poorly designed website called Meadowview Honey Company, featuring a photo of Vanessa in her sun hat and mosquito net, smiling like she'd invented beekeeping. The honey was listed at $15 a jar, twice what Jack charged for his good stuff. The description read, handcrafted by the Meadowview HOA, sourced from our exclusive community hives. Pure, organic, and unique. There were already a handful of one-star reviews. Tastes like battery acid. Worst honey I've ever had. Do not buy this. Jack sat back, shaking his head. Vanessa's stubbornness was digging her deeper every day, and he was content to let her flail, at least for now. But when Saturday rolled around, things took a turn he hadn't expected. He was tending to his garden when Mrs. Delaney rushed over, out of breath. Jack, you've got to see this. Vanessa's out front with a megaphone. A megaphone? Jack frowned, setting down his trowel. What now? He followed her to the street, where a small crowd had gathered. Vanessa stood in the middle of Meadowview Lane, megaphone in hand, her hair slightly frizzy from the morning humidity. She wore a crisp white blazer and a determined expression, like she was about to announce a political campaign. Attention, residents, she blared, her voice echoing off the houses. The Meadowview HOA is proud to introduce our new community initiative, Meadowview Honey. Proceeds will fund beautification projects to make our neighborhood the envy of the county. Support your HOA and buy a jar today. Jack crossed his arms, watching as a few neighbors exchanged skeptical glances. One guy, Tom from across the street, called out, "That the same honey you've been peddling at the market? 'Cause I heard it's trash." Vanessa's smile tightened. That was an early batch. We've refined the process. It's a premium product now. Premium, my ass. Tom muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people snickered. Jack stepped forward, unable to resist. Hey, Vanessa, how's that refined process treating my bees? They still alive back there? Her head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Your bees? These are HOA property now, Jack. You forfeited them when you refused to follow regulations. Regulations you made up, he shot back. Last I checked, stealing's not in the HOA handbook. The crowd murmured, and Vanessa's face flushed. This isn't theft, it's community management. And if you don't like it, take it up with the board. Oh, I will, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. But I'm guessing the board's not gonna like what's coming next. She glared at him, but before she could respond, a bee buzzed past her face, then another. Jack glanced toward her backyard, where the hives were just visible over the fence. The bees were restless, probably stirred up by her latest poking and prodding. Vanessa swatted at the air, her megaphone slipping as she stumbled backward. "Get these things away from me," she yelped, flailing again. The crowd scattered as more bees drifted into the street, and Vanessa retreated to her house, slamming the door behind her. Jack watched her go, a slow grin spreading across his face. She was falling apart, piece by piece, and he hadn't even had to lift a finger yet. But he wasn't done. Not even close. Vanessa wanted a war? She was about to get one. Jack Grayson knew Vanessa Hargrove wouldn't go down without a fight, but he also knew she'd never see the Environmental Protection Agency coming. After filing his complaint, he'd spent the next few days tending to his garden and waiting for the inevitable. He didn't tell anyone, not even Mrs. Delaney, about the EPA report. He wanted Vanessa to be blindsided, just like he'd been when she stole his hives. The morning after he'd called her out in the street, Jack woke to the sound of a vehicle rumbling down Meadowview Lane. He stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and saw it. A white van with an EPA logo stamped on the side, pulling into Vanessa's driveway. Two agents stepped out, a stern-looking woman with a clipboard and a lanky man carrying a field kit. They scanned the area with the kind of no-nonsense focus that told Jack this wasn't a courtesy call. He set his mug down and wandered over to his garden, pretending to weed while keeping an eye on the scene. Vanessa emerged from her house a minute later, still in a pink silk robe, clutching a coffee cup of her own. Her hair was a mess, and her usual smugness was nowhere to be seen. She froze when she saw the agents, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Good morning, ma'am," the woman said, her voice clipped. "I'm Agent Carter, and this is Agent Ruiz. We're with the Environmental Protection Agency. We're here to investigate a report of unauthorized beekeeping and potential environmental violations." Vanessa blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. What? There must be some mistake. I'm just running a little community project." "No mistake," Agent Carter interrupted, flipping open her clipboard. "We received a detailed complaint about beehives being improperly managed in a residential area. Can you show us where they're located?" Vanessa laughed, a high, nervous sound, and waved a hand. "Oh, it's nothing serious. Just a few bees for a honey project. I'm bringing the neighborhood together." "Ma'am," Agent Ruiz cut in, adjusting his glasses, "beekeeping without permits in a residential zone can carry fines up to $10,000. If there's environmental damage, like harm to pollinator habitats, that's additional penalties. We need to see the hives." Vanessa's face went pale, the coffee cup trembling in her hand. She tried to recover, forcing a smile. "Well, I have permission from the HOA. The bees were abandoned. Really, I rescued them from poor conditions." Jack, still weeding 20 yards away, had to bite his lip to keep from laughing. Abandoned? Rescued? She was grasping at straws, and the agents weren't buying it. "We'll need documentation," Agent Carter said, unmoved. "Permits, safety measures, proof of ownership. Can you provide that?" Vanessa scoffed, her first mistake. "It's just bees. What kind of permit do I need for some bugs?" Agent Carter's eyes narrowed. "Bees aren't bugs, ma'am. They're pollinators, protected under state law. Let's see the hives." Vanessa hesitated, then led them to the backyard, her robe swishing with every reluctant step. Jack abandoned his fake gardening and followed at a distance, joining a few curious neighbors who'd started to gather. The agents approached the hives, and even from the fence, Jack could see the damage. The frames were misaligned, the bees were buzzing erratically, and there was a faint chemical sheen on the wood. Pesticide residue, no doubt. Agent Ruiz bent down, swiped a finger across a slat, and sniffed. He frowned. "Ma'am, have you been spraying pesticides near these hives?" Vanessa shook her head so fast her hair bounced. "Of course not. I'd never." "We had to," Martin blurted, stepping out from the doorway. "They were getting aggressive. My wife got stung, and we had customers complaining about bees flying around." The backyard went silent. Vanessa's head whipped toward Martin, her eyes wide with fury, but the damage was done. Agent Carter scribbled something on her clipboard, and Agent Ruiz pulled a bottle of insecticide from the grass near the hives, right where Martin had tossed it days ago. Agent Carter shook her head. Ma'am, not only have you illegally taken and mishandled these hives, but you've actively endangered the colony. Pesticides near bee populations can cause colony collapse. That's a serious environmental issue. These hives need to be confiscated for assessment, and there will be further action against you and the HOA. Vanessa looked like she might faint. Confiscated? You can't. I'm just a community leader. Surely we can work something out. The penalties are non-negotiable, Agent Carter said, her tone final. We'll be in touch. The agents began packing up the hives, and Vanessa stood there, clutching her robe, her empire crumbling around her. Jack watched, sipping his coffee, as they loaded the van and drove off. He didn't say a word, just gave her a small wave as he headed back to his house. She glared after him, but there was nothing she could do. That should have been the end of it, but the EPA didn't stop with the bees. Over the next few days, they dug deeper, uncovering a laundry list of HOA violations, all tied to Vanessa's beautification schemes. The community garden she'd torn up for decorative shrubs, a registered pollinator zone she wasn't allowed to touch, the old oak trees she'd had cut down, protected by local laws, the pesticides she'd used to keep Meadowview pest-free, unapproved for residential use. Every violation came with a fine, and the total started climbing fast. By the end of the week, Jack heard Vanessa screaming from her driveway. He wandered over, coffee in hand, and saw her waving a stack of papers at Martin. $30,000, she screeched. They're fining us $30,000. We don't have that kind of money. Martin, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in a week, muttered, Well, maybe you shouldn't have stolen the beehives, Vanessa. Jack nearly choked on his coffee, turning away to hide his grin. Vanessa spotted him and pointed a trembling finger. This is your fault, Grayson. You did this. He turned back, calm as ever. Actually, you did this to yourself. She opened her mouth to scream again, but a new voice cut through the chaos. Vanessa, said Mr. Holloway, an older HOA board member who'd always quietly despised her. He stepped forward, holding a petition. We had a vote this morning. You're out as HOA president, effective immediately. Vanessa's eyes widened. You can't. We can, Holloway said. And we did. Enjoy your day. He walked off, leaving Vanessa stunned and silent. Jack gave her a nod and headed home, the satisfaction settling deep in his bones. She'd lost her bees, her position, and her reputation, all in a week. But he knew Vanessa. She wouldn't let it end there. Jack Grayson thought Vanessa Hargrove's downfall would be the end of their saga. She'd been humiliated, fined, and stripped of her HOA throne. What else was there to fight for? But Vanessa wasn't wired like most people. Where others would lick their wounds and move on, she doubled down, fueled by a mix of spite and delusion. Jack didn't realize how far she'd go until the night he caught her sneaking onto his property. It was just past midnight when he heard it, a faint rustling near his bee enclosures. He'd rebuilt them after the EPA returned his hives, setting them up in the same quiet corner of his yard. At first, he thought it was the wind, or maybe a raccoon rummaging through the compost. But then he saw a shadow move between the hives, a human figure, crouched low. Jack grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He flipped on the beam and aimed it at the figure. There she was, Vanessa, dressed head to toe in black, a jogging suit and a ski mask, fumbling with the latches on his hives. She froze, caught in the light, her hands still gripping the wood. Vanessa, Jack said, crossing his arms. I don't know what's worse, the fact that you're trespassing or the fact that you think this is going to end well for you. She straightened up, trying to muster some dignity despite the ridiculous getup. I was just, she started, but Jack cut her off with a laugh. Just what? Stealing my bees again? Letting them loose? What's the plan here? She yanked off the ski mask, her hair wild and her face flushed. You ruined my life, Jack. I lost my position, my reputation, my savings, all because of you. No, he said, stepping closer. You lost all that because you stole my property and broke half a dozen laws. Actions have consequences. Her jaw clenched, but then a sly smile crept across her face. You have no proof I was doing anything illegal. I could have just been admiring the bees. Jack sighed, shaking his head. Vanessa, I have security cameras. Her smile faltered, her eyes darting around as if she could spot the lenses in the dark. Before she could argue, the bees took matters into their own hands. One of the hives she'd been tampering with was slightly ajar, and the disturbance had riled them up. A low buzz grew into a roar, and then the swarm poured out, a wave of fury heading straight for her. Vanessa screamed, flailing her arms as the bees descended. Jack stepped back, watching as she spun in circles, trying to outrun them. She bolted for the fence, misjudged the jump, and crashed headfirst into his vegetable patch, thrashing in the dirt as the bees swarmed her hair and clothes. By the time she scrambled up and ran off down the road, she was a mess, twigs in her hair, red welts on her face, and her black outfit smeared with mud. Jack could have let it go. He could have laughed it off and gone back to bed. But Vanessa had crossed too many lines. He pulled out his phone and dialed the police, giving them a calm rundown of the trespassing and attempted vandalism. By the time Vanessa stumbled home, panting and swollen, 2 officers were waiting in her driveway. She froze, staring at them, then at Jack, who'd followed at a distance. "You called the cops?" she shrieked. "Yep," Jack said, hands in his pockets. "You're done, Vanessa." The officers questioned her, but she had nothing to say, no excuses, no deflections. For once, she was speechless. They cuffed her and led her to the patrol car, her head bowed in defeat. Jack watched them drive off, the night quiet again except for the soft buzz of his bees settling back into their hives. The next morning, the HOA board sent out a letter to every resident, officially banning Vanessa from any leadership role and distancing themselves from her actions. It was the final nail in her coffin, publicly shunned, her reign of terror over. Vanessa Hargrove's arrest should have been the end of it, but she wasn't one to fade quietly. A few weeks later, Jack heard she'd put her house up for sale, unable to handle the humiliation of living in a neighborhood that now openly despised her. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the moving trucks arrived. Jack watched from his porch as movers hauled out her furniture, her pristine sectional sofa, her gaudy chandeliers, while Vanessa stood in the driveway, barking orders and avoiding eye contact with the neighbors who'd gathered to gawk. No one was sad to see her go. If anything, Meadowview felt lighter without her. People started chatting over fences again, planting flowers without fear of a fine, even parking their trucks wherever they damn well pleased. It was like a dark cloud had lifted, and Jack couldn't have been happier. He celebrated in his own way, expanding his beekeeping operation now that the HOA wasn't breathing down his neck. With Vanessa gone, the new board, led by the sensible Mr. Holloway, came to him for advice on eco-friendly projects. They turned the old community garden back into a pollinator haven, and Jack's honey business boomed. His jars, labeled simply Grayson's Honey, became a staple at the farmer's market, and he couldn't keep up with the demand. The last he heard of Vanessa came months later, through Pete's cousin who lived across town. She'd moved to a new community and, predictably, started clashing with their HOA within weeks. Some people never learned. But Jack didn't care anymore. She was someone else's problem now. One evening, he sat on his porch, sipping tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. His farm stretched out before him, hives buzzing, garden thriving, the air sweet with the scent of clover. A single bee landed on his arm, resting there for a moment before buzzing off. "Good job, little guy," Jack said, smiling. And just like that, life was sweet again.